I disappeared on a Tuesday. Not dramatically. Not with a note pinned to the refrigerator or a tearful goodbye at the door. I simply packed one suitcase, withdrew $3,000 in cash, and drove away from 45 years of my life while my daughter was texting me about whether I could pick up her kids from gymnastics. I was 70 years old, and for the first time since I was 23, I chose myself. And let me tell you, it felt like committing murder. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You need to understand who I was before I became the woman who ghosted her own children. You need to know about the birthday party. 6 months before I vanished, my 3 children threw me a 70th birthday celebration. It sounds lovely, doesn't it? Sarah, my oldest, baked a cake, store-bought, but she did write on it herself. David, my middle child, brought flowers, wilted, but he remembered. Emily, my youngest, showed up late but showed up, which lately felt like an accomplishment. They sang happy birthday off-key while my 5 grandchildren screamed and ran circles around my living room, the one Harold and I had carefully furnished over decades of modest paychecks and patient saving. I remember standing there, Harold's absence like a black hole beside me. He'd been gone 2 years by then, and I watched my family. Really watched them. Sarah was on her phone, texting someone about a work crisis that apparently couldn't wait through her mother's birthday song. David kept checking his watch because he had a tea time in an hour. Emily was snapping at her husband in harsh whispers that everyone pretended not to hear. And the grandchildren, bless them, barely looked at me except to ask when we were having cake. I smiled. I cut the cake. I thanked them profusely for coming. I played my role perfectly, the grateful mother, the doting grandmother, the woman who existed solely to make everyone else's life easier. And when they left, all of them, making excuses about traffic and early mornings and kids' bedtimes, I sat in my empty house and realized something terrifying. If I had died right then, collapsed with a heart attack over that half-eaten cake, how long would it have taken them to notice? And when they did, would they grieve for me, Margaret Chen, or would they just panic about who was going to watch the kids on Tuesday? That thought should have felt cruel. Instead, it felt true. And that was so much worse. My name is Margaret Chen, though most people have called me Mom or Grandma or Harold's wife, for so long that I sometimes forget I had a name before I had a function. I raised 3 children in a modest suburban home with a husband who loved me in that quiet, steady way that doesn't make for good stories but makes for a good life. Harold was an accountant. I was a librarian until Sarah was born, and then I was a mother, which somehow became a career I never got to retire from. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable. We weren't exciting, but we were content. Or at least I thought we were. When Harold died of a sudden heart attack at 68, 2 weeks after his retirement party, I grieved like I was being torn in half. 45 years of marriage doesn't just end, it amputates. And while I was bleeding out, trying to figure out who Margaret was without Harold, my children stepped in with their solution. They needed me. More specifically, they needed my time, my labor, and my constant availability. And I gave it to them because that's what mothers do, isn't it? We give until there's nothing left, and then we give the nothing too. It started small. Sarah needed help with the kids while she worked. Her husband traveled for business, and daycare was expensive. Just Tuesdays and Thursdays, she said. Just until things settled down. That was 2 years ago. David started calling every night, anxiety spiraling about his job, his marriage, his mortgage, his health. He needed to process, he said. He needed his mom. Emily dropped by unannounced 3 or 4 times a week, treating my home like a free therapy office and my refrigerator like a grocery store she didn't have to pay for. And I said yes. To all of it. Every single time. Tuesday and Thursday childcare became Monday through Friday. David's nightly calls stretched from 20 minutes to 2 hours. Emily's visits came with expectations. I should have coffee ready, snacks prepared, advice dispensed, and validation served hot and endless. Sunday dinners became my responsibility to host, cook, and clean up from while everyone else lounged in my living room, complaining about how tired they were. I became invisible. Not absent. God, I was never absent. but invisible in the way that infrastructure is invisible. You don't notice the electricity until it goes out. You don't appreciate the water until the tap runs dry. I was the system that kept their lives running, and as long as I functioned, they never had to see me. Harold used to notice. In those last years, he'd watch me run myself ragged and say, "Maggie, you're allowed to say no." But saying no felt impossible. I'd raised them to need me. How could I blame them for learning the lesson I'd taught so well? The breaking point came on a Tuesday. Of course it was a Tuesday. It was the second anniversary of Harold's death, and I'd planned a small memorial at our house, just family, just an hour to remember the man who'd been the center of our family for nearly half a century. I'd put out photos of Harold, printed his favorite poems, and baked his favorite lemon cake from scratch even though my arthritis made it painful. I wanted to honor him. I wanted us to remember together. Sarah arrived late, kids in tow, already stressed. David showed up but kept stepping outside to take work calls. Emily spent the entire time on my couch, crying about her marriage while I made coffee and rubbed her back. No one looked at the photos. No one read the poems. We cut the cake, Harold's cake, while standing in the kitchen like it was just another Tuesday. And then David asked me to leave early. From my own husband's memorial. From my own grief. Because his kids needed to be picked up from soccer practice, and his wife had a work thing, and traffic would be bad. Could I please, Mom, just this once, handle it? I heard myself say yes. I watched myself pack up Harold's photos while my children checked their phones. I got in my car and drove to that soccer field and collected grandchildren who barely said hello, and something inside me cracked so loudly I was surprised no one else could hear it. That night, I sat in Harold's den. I still called it his den, even 2 years later, because some spaces belong to the dead more than the living, and I let myself ask the question I'd been swallowing for months. If I disappeared tomorrow, what would they miss? Would they miss me, Margaret, the woman who loved photography and once dreamed of seeing Paris and could name every constellation Harold ever taught me? Or would they just miss their free childcare, their emotional support hotline, and their unpaid labor? I knew the answer. God help me, I knew. I started crying then, really crying for the first time since Harold's funeral. Not the polite tears you cry in front of people, but the ugly, gasping sobs that come from somewhere deep and wounded. And in that crying, a thought emerged that felt both dangerous and necessary. What if I just left? Not forever. Not to hurt them. Just to see. Just to breathe. Just to find out if Margaret Chin still existed underneath the layers of Mom and Grandma and the woman who always says yes. The thought terrified me. It also thrilled me. And I couldn't tell which feeling was stronger. For 2 weeks I wrestled with it. The guilt was crushing. These were my children. I'd raised them, loved them, and sacrificed for them. You don't just walk away from that. Except I kept coming back to what Harold said in the hospital, in those last clear moments before the morphine took him somewhere I couldn't follow. He'd gripped my hand with surprising strength and said, "Maggie, promise me you'll finally do something for yourself. Promise me you'll stop disappearing." I'd laughed it off, kissed his forehead, and told him he was being dramatic. But he wasn't. He'd seen what I couldn't, that I'd been vanishing for years, piece by piece, need by need, until I was just a collection of services rendered. I started planning in secret, which felt like betrayal but also like survival. I researched small towns in Oregon. I'd never been to the Pacific Northwest, never seen that wild coastline Harold always wanted to visit. I looked at rental apartments I could afford on my widow's pension. I practiced the words I'd write in the note I'd leave behind. Each step felt impossible and necessary in equal measure. And then, on a Tuesday morning in late September, while my phone buzzed with Sarah's text about gymnastics pickup, I chose. I packed one suitcase with practical clothes and one photo of Harold and the watercolor set I'd bought myself in college and never used. I withdrew $3,000 in cash from the bank. I wrote a single note on the back of a grocery receipt because I couldn't bear to make it formal. "I'm safe. I need time. Don't look for me. Mom." I left it on the kitchen counter, weighted down with my wedding rings. And then I got in my car, hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel, and I drove. I didn't let myself look back at the house. I didn't let myself think about Sunday dinner or Tuesday childcare or David's anxiety or Emily's marriage. I just drove, heading west toward mountains I'd never seen and an ocean I'd only imagined. The terror was overwhelming. Every mile, I expected to turn back. Every exit, I thought about calling them. But somewhere around the Idaho border, something shifted. The guilt was still there. It would always be there. But underneath it, I felt something I hadn't felt in decades. Not quite joy. Not quite peace. But possibility. The strange, terrifying, exhilarating possibility that Margaret Chen might still exist. I didn't know what I was driving toward. I only knew what I was driving away from, a life where I'd become so small, so invisible, so consumed by everyone else's needs that I'd forgotten I had any of my own. Was that selfish? Maybe. Was it necessary? God, I hoped so. Because here's what I'd learned in 70 years. You can love people so much you disappear in the process. You can give so completely that there's nothing left to give. And when that happens, you have two choices. You can keep disappearing until you're gone. Or you can do what I did. You can ghost your own life before it ghosts you first. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking I'm a terrible mother. Maybe you're right. Or maybe I'm just a woman who finally chose herself after a lifetime of choosing everyone else. Maybe I'm both. Maybe that's the truth no one wants to admit, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. I haven't told you yet about what happened when I arrived in that small Oregon town, or about the woman I met who'd made the same escape 5 years earlier, or about the voicemails that piled up on the phone I finally turned back on. I haven't told you about my granddaughter's message that broke me or the panic attacks that started when I realized running away didn't solve anything. It just gave me space to see the problem clearly. All of that is coming. But first, you need to sit with this question, the same one I sat with for 2 weeks in Harold's Den, while my family expected me to keep performing the role I'd played for 45 years. How much of yourself are you allowed to lose before choosing yourself stops being selfish and starts being survival? Think about that. Because in Act 2, you're going to find out what happened when I finally tried to answer it. I turned off my phone at the Oregon border. Not immediately, of course. For the first 3 hours of driving, it sat on my passenger seat like a live grenade, buzzing and chiming with the fury of children who just discovered that their infrastructure had collapsed. Sarah called 6 times before I even left my home state. David left voicemails that grew progressively more panicked. Emily sent 17 text messages that devolved from concern to anger to something that looked a lot like entitlement wearing a mask of worry. And I watched it all happen, the screen lighting up over and over, while I drove through a landscape I'd never seen before, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not guilt, not yet. But power. The terrifying, intoxicating power of being unavailable. At a rest stop just past the state line, I held that phone in my hands, my lifeline to everything I'd ever known, and I thought about Harold. About how he used to silence his phone during our Sunday morning walks, back when Sunday mornings belonged to us instead of family obligation. "The world will wait, Maggie," he'd say. "It always does. And if it won't, maybe that says more about the world than about us." I'd thought it was romantic nonsense then. Now, sitting in a rest stop bathroom that smelled like industrial cleaner and broken promises, I understood. He was teaching me something I'd refused to learn. That I had permission. That I could choose. So I turned it off. I held down that power button until the screen went black, and then I sat there, staring at my reflection in the dead glass, and I didn't recognize the woman looking back. She looked older than 70. Tired. Haunted. But underneath all that, something else. Something I couldn't quite name yet. It would take me weeks to find the word. It was hope. The drive to Cannon Beach took 2 days. I could have made it in 1, but I wasn't running towards something. I was running from everything, and there's a difference. That first night, I checked into a roadside motel with a flickering vacancy sign and sheets that smelled like bleach and other people's sleep, and I lay there in the dark, fully clothed, convinced I'd made the most catastrophic mistake of my life. The silence was suffocating. For 45 years, I'd fallen asleep to Harold's breathing, and for 2 years after that, I'd fallen asleep to the phantom echo of it. Now there was nothing. Just me and the sound of trucks on the highway and the crushing weight of what I'd done. I didn't sleep. I stared at the water-stained ceiling, and I bargained with myself. I could turn back. I could turn on the phone, call Sarah, and say it was all a misunderstanding, that I'd had a breakdown, but I was fine now, ready to resume my post. They'd be angry, sure, but they'd forgive me because they needed me. And wasn't being needed a form of love? Didn't it count for something? But then I remembered David at Harold's memorial, asking me to leave. And I remembered Emily crying on my couch about her marriage while I comforted her, never once asking how I was surviving widowhood. And I remembered Sarah's text, not, "Mom, are you okay?" but, "Mom, can you pick up the kids?" And I realized something that should have been obvious years ago. Being needed and being loved are not the same thing. Not even close. I drove the rest of the way to Cannon Beach the next morning, and when I finally saw the Pacific Ocean, that wild, gray, endless expanse of water that looked nothing like the calm lake waters Harold and I had vacationed at, I pulled over and I cried. Not sad tears. Not guilty tears. Something else. Relief tears, maybe? Or grief tears for all the years I'd spent landlocked, not just geographically but emotionally, trapped in a life that had gotten smaller and smaller until it was just the size of other people's needs. The apartment I'd rented was tiny, a studio above a bookstore, one room with a kitchenette and a bathroom barely big enough to turn around in. It cost more than I should have spent, but it had a window that looked out at the ocean, and when the real estate agent asked why I wanted it, I heard myself say, "Because I've never seen the ocean before." Not really. And I'm 70 years old, and if not now, then when? She looked at me strangely. This woman may be 35 who probably couldn't imagine being 70, couldn't imagine having never done something she wanted. But she rented it to me, and I moved in with my one suitcase and my watercolors and Harold's photo, and for the first time in decades I had a space that was entirely mine. The first week was harder than I'd imagined. Not because I regretted leaving, though God knows the guilt was a constant companion, but because I didn't know how to be alone with myself. For 45 years, I'd been Harold's wife. For 48 years before that, I'd been someone's daughter, someone's student, someone's employee, always defined by my relationship to other people. And now, in this tiny apartment with the ocean wind rattling the windows, I was just Margaret. And I had no idea who that was. I'd wake up at 6 in the morning, habit dies hard, and for a few confused seconds, I'd think I needed to start breakfast for Harold, or prepare for the grandkids, or return David's call from last night. And then I'd remember. There was no Harold. There were no grandkids here. David's call would go unreturned because I'd chosen this. And the panic would set in, sharp and breathless, because if I wasn't doing those things, then what was I doing? What was I for? That's when I met Diane. It was a Tuesday. Everything in my life seemed to happen on Tuesdays, and I was at a small coffee shop called The Grateful Mug, trying to make a single cup of coffee last 3 hours because I didn't know what else to do with myself. I was staring out the window at people living their lives, wondering if any of them had ever ghosted their entire family, when a woman slid into the seat across from me without asking. She was maybe 65, with wild silver hair she hadn't bothered to tame and eyes that looked like they'd seen everything and found most of it amusing. She set down her coffee, studied me for a long moment, and said, "Let me guess. Adult children who forgot you're human?" I must have looked shocked because she laughed, not unkindly. "Honey, you've got a look. I had the same look 5 years ago when I showed up here. It's the look of a woman who finally chose herself and doesn't know whether to celebrate or confess." And just like that, I started talking. Not carefully, not the edited version I'd perfected over decades of being the good mother, the supportive wife, and the woman who never complained. I told her everything. About Harold's death and the memorial service and the Tuesday childcare that became Monday through Friday and the way I'd slowly vanished until I was just a function, not a person. I told her about the note I'd left and the phone I'd turned off and the crushing, liberating terror of being unavailable. Diane listened without interrupting, and when I finally ran out of words, she said something I've never forgotten. The question isn't whether you were right to leave. The question is whether you have the courage to stay gone long enough to remember who you are. She became my guide, though I didn't realize it at first. Diane had done her own version of my escape 5 years earlier, walking away from a suffocating marriage and adult children who'd learned to weaponize her guilt. She hadn't ghosted them completely, but she'd moved 3,000 miles and rebuilt her life on her own terms. It took me 2 years. She told me over coffee that stretched into lunch, and then dinner. 2 years before I could talk to them without disappearing back into who they needed me to be. You think a week or 2 is going to fix 48 years of training? Honey, you're in for a long haul. She was right, of course. But in those early weeks, I wasn't thinking long term. I was just trying to survive each day, each hour, each moment of crushing silence where I had to figure out what Margaret wanted when there was no one else's needs to organize my time around. Diane introduced me to her life, and slowly, carefully, I started building something that looked like mine. She took me to a watercolor class at the community center. I'd brought those paints from home but hadn't touched them yet, too afraid I'd be terrible, too afraid that the dream of painting was better than the reality. But Diane signed us both up, and suddenly I was in a room full of strangers, brush in hand, trying to capture the ocean I'd only just discovered. I was terrible. God, I was catastrophically bad. My waves looked like lumpy mountains. My sky bled into my water in ways that weren't artistic, just muddy. But Diane looked at my first attempt, this disaster of a painting that looked like a child's crayon drawing done with watercolors, and she said, "It's perfect. Not because it's good. Because it's yours and you made it for yourself and no one else." I cried right there in that class, brush still in my hand, while a room full of retirees pretended not to notice. But here's what I haven't told you yet, what I've been circling around because it's the part that makes this story complicated, the part that makes me not just a woman reclaiming her life but maybe also a grandmother who broke a child's heart. Because while I was discovering watercolors and ocean walks and what it felt like to eat cereal for dinner just because I felt like it, my phone sat in a drawer, turned off, and the messages piled up. And I knew they were there. I could feel them, like a growing tumor I was pretending not to notice. 3 weeks after I left, I turned the phone back on. Just for a minute. Just to see. 47 missed calls. 63 text messages. 14 voicemails. And I sat on the floor of my tiny apartment, phone in my lap, and I made myself listen to them all. Every single one. Because I owed them that much, didn't I? Even if I didn't owe them my return, I owed them my attention. The pattern was exactly what I'd expected, and that somehow made it worse. On days 1 through 3, the messages were worried. Concerned. "Mom, where are you? Mom, please call us back. Mom, this isn't funny, we're scared." But by day 4, the fear had curdled into something else. Anger. Inconvenience. "Mom, we have jobs. We can't just drop everything. Mom, the kids are asking for you, and I don't know what to tell them. Mom, how could you do this to us?" Notice what I noticed. Not once, not in 47 calls and 63 texts, did anyone ask if I was okay. Not really. They asked where I was, when I was coming back, why I was being selfish. But none of them, not even once, asked the question that mattered. "Are you hurting? Do you need something? Did we do something wrong?" David's voicemails were the worst because they were the most manipulative, and he didn't even know he was doing it. That's the thing about emotional manipulation from your own children. Sometimes it's not intentional. It's just what they've learned works. He'd call, his voice shaking with what I knew was genuine anxiety, and he'd say things like, "Mom, I can't sleep. I can't focus at work. I keep thinking something happened to you. I keep thinking I'm going to get a call that you're dead." Don't you care what this is doing to me? And I'd sit there, listening, feeling the old instinct kick in, the need to soothe him, to manage his anxiety, to make myself small enough that he could feel big again. But I didn't call back. Because Diane had asked me a question I couldn't stop thinking about. When did your children's feelings become more important than your survival? Sarah's messages were efficient, organized, and increasingly angry. She'd found childcare, she wanted me to know. It was expensive and not as good as me, and the kids were confused and acting out, but she'd managed. Did I feel good about that? Did I feel good about disrupting everyone's lives because I needed, what? A vacation? A tantrum? At 70 years old, didn't I think I was a little too old for a midlife crisis? She hoped I was happy, wherever I was. She hoped it was worth it. The subtext was clear. You're hurting us, and you're doing it on purpose, and we'll never forgive you. Emily didn't leave voicemails. She sent long, rambling text messages that swung between fury and emotional blackmail. At one point she wrote, "You taught us that family means sacrifice. You taught us that mothers don't abandon their children no matter how hard things get. Was that all a lie? Or does it only work one direction?" And that message, more than any other, made me question everything. Because she was right, wasn't she? I had taught them that. Every time I'd said yes when I meant no, every time I'd put their needs ahead of my own health, my own joy, my own existence, I'd taught them a lesson. The lesson was this: mothers are infinite. Mothers don't run out. Mothers don't need. And now I was proving that lesson wrong, and they were furious about it. But then I got to the last voicemail, and everything changed. It was from Emma, my 8-year-old granddaughter. Sarah's the youngest. The quiet one who liked to sit in my lap during story time and who always remembered to say thank you when I made her favorite cookies. Her little voice came through my phone speaker, and I could hear she'd been crying. "Grandma? It's Emma. Mom says you went away and you need time, but I don't understand. Did I do something wrong? Because if I did, I'm sorry. I'm really, really sorry. I miss you a lot. I don't like the new babysitter. She's nice, but she's not you. Please come home. Or at least call me. I just want to know if you still love me." I listened to that message 6 times, and by the 6th time, I couldn't breathe right. My chest felt tight, my hands were shaking, and I realized I was having what Diane would later tell me was a panic attack. Because Emma hadn't done anything wrong. None of the grandchildren had. They were innocent parties in a war between their parents' entitlement and my belated self-preservation. And Emma was asking the question that was going to haunt me for months. Did Grandma still love her? Or had Grandma's need for freedom meant abandoning the people who actually had no power in this situation? I called Diane, sobbing so hard I could barely speak. She came over with wine and tissues and held space for my breakdown without trying to fix it. And when I finally calmed down enough to talk, I said what I'd been afraid to say out loud. What if I made a mistake? What if running away was just another form of destruction? What if I'm not brave, I'm just selfish? Diane let me spiral. She let me work through every worst-case scenario, every guilt-soaked hypothetical. And then she said something that changed the trajectory of everything. The question isn't whether you go back, Margaret. The question is whether you're strong enough to go back different. Because if you go back the way you left, broken, depleted, invisible, Emma loses you anyway. Your grandchildren don't need the grandmother who disappears inside herself. They need the one who shows them it's possible to matter. Even when you're old. Even when everyone expects you not to. But before I could figure out what that meant, before I could plan my next move, the universe decided to raise the stakes. It was week 4. I just started to find a rhythm. Morning walks on the beach. Watercolor class twice a week. Coffee with Diane. I'd even made a friend at the library, a woman named June who was 82 and had left her family 30 years ago and never looked back. She terrified me and fascinated me in equal measure. I was learning to be alone without being lonely. I was learning that there was a difference between solitude and isolation. I was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, I could survive this. And then Sarah found my P.O. box. I don't know how she did it. Maybe she hired someone. Maybe she got lucky. Maybe she was just that desperate. But a letter arrived, real mail, physical paper, and I knew before I opened it that everything was about to change. The envelope was addressed in Sarah's careful handwriting. She'd always had beautiful penmanship, and for a long moment, I just held it. Because once I opened it, the door I closed would crack open again, and all the voices I'd been trying to quiet would come flooding back in. I made myself coffee. I sat at my tiny table overlooking the ocean. I opened the letter. It was 4 pages, handwritten, and it was the most honest my daughter had been with me in 20 years. She didn't start with anger, which surprised me. She started with a memory. She wrote about being 7 years old and coming home from school to find me in the hospital. I'd had emergency surgery for appendicitis, and how terrified she'd been because, for the first time, she understood that mothers could disappear. That mothers were mortal. And she wrote about how I'd come home 3 days later and immediately started taking care of everyone, even though I could barely walk. "You made us dinner that first night home," she wrote. "You could barely stand up, but you made dinner because you said that's what mothers do. And I learned something that day. I learned that mothers endure. That mothers sacrifice. That mothers don't stop, even when they should. You taught me that, Mom. And now you're punishing me for learning the lesson you spent 40 years teaching." The letter went on. She cataloged all the ways my disappearance had disrupted her life, the childcare scramble, the expense, and the confusion of explaining to her children where Grandma went. But underneath the practical complaints, there was something rawer. Fear. She was afraid I was never coming back. She was afraid I'd died and she'd never know. She was afraid that she'd failed as a daughter, that she'd taken too much, asked too much, and needed too much. She was afraid she'd broken me and that this was my way of saying it was too late to fix it. And then, in the last paragraph, she wrote something that absolutely gutted me. "Mom, I know I haven't been a good daughter. I know I took advantage. I know I treated you like hired help instead of my mother. But I don't know when that happened. I don't remember the moment where you became someone I used instead of someone I loved. And now you're gone and I don't know how to fix it and I don't even know if you want me to. So I guess I'm asking, do you want me to fix it? Or have you decided you're better off without us?" I read that letter 7 times, and each time I found new layers. Anger and guilt and pain and manipulation and genuine love all tangled together in a way that probably reflected our actual relationship better than any of us wanted to admit. Because that was the truth, wasn't it? None of this was simple. They weren't villains who'd consciously decided to exploit me. I wasn't a martyr who nobly sacrificed and asked for nothing. We built this dynamic together, brick by brick, need by need, over decades of not saying what we meant and not meaning what we said. I didn't respond immediately. I couldn't. Because responding meant deciding who I was going to be, and I wasn't ready yet. Instead, I kept living my new life, but now it was haunted. Every watercolor class, I thought about Emma's voicemail. Every walk on the beach, I thought about Sarah's letter. Every coffee with Diane, I wondered if I was just running away or if I was genuinely healing. And slowly, so slowly, I started to realize something Diane had been trying to tell me all along. You can't run from your family forever. Not because you owe them your return, but because the ghosts follow you anyway. The only way to be free was to confront them. Not to surrender to them, but to show up as someone new and see if they could handle it. But I wasn't ready yet. And the universe seemed determined to make sure I faced the cost of waiting. Week 6 brought the message I'd been dreading. David's text was brief, unusually brief for him, which is how I knew it was serious. "Mom, I'm in the hospital. Minor heart scare. I'm fine. Don't come back. Just thought you should know." And then nothing. Radio silence. No details. No follow-up. Just that message, calculated or not, designed to make me feel exactly what I felt. Terror. Guilt. The overwhelming need to fix, to comfort, to manage. I called Diane in a panic, and she asked me the hard questions. Is he actually in danger? No, the text said he was fine. Does he have people with him? Yes, he has a wife and 2 adult siblings. Does he need you specifically, or does he need someone to manage his anxiety about mortality? I didn't answer because we both knew. So the question, Margaret, is whether you go running back because your 48-year-old son had a medical scare he told you not to worry about, or whether you trust that he's an adult who can handle this without his mother. I didn't go back. But I also didn't sleep for 3 days. I lay in my tiny apartment, staring at the ceiling, imagining David in a hospital bed, imagining him dying without me there, imagining being the mother who chose herself over her child's crisis. Never mind that it wasn't a crisis. Never mind that he was fine. The programming ran too deep. Good mothers show up. Good mothers sacrifice. Good mothers don't choose the ocean over their children's fear. But here's what finally broke me. Here's what made me realize I couldn't keep running and I couldn't go back to who I was. On day 7 of my breakdown, I called the hospital. Not David, I called the hospital directly, said I was his mother, and asked about his condition. And the nurse, kind but professional, told me he'd been discharged 4 days ago. 4 days. He'd been home, safe, and fine for 4 days, and no one had thought to tell me. Not David. Not Sarah. Not Emily. And that's when I understood. They didn't need me there. They needed me anxious. They needed me guilty. They needed me controllable. And as long as I was 3,000 miles away, silent, and unavailable, I was none of those things. So they'd weaponize the one thing they knew would work. Fear. The threat of loss. The possibility that something terrible would happen and I'd have to live with choosing wrong. I sat with that realization for a long time. And then I made a decision. It was time to stop running. But it was also time to stop being who they needed me to be. Diane was right. I couldn't go back the same. But I also couldn't stay gone forever, hiding in this beautiful coastal town, pretending I didn't have 48 years of history and 3 children and 5 grandchildren who were part of my story even if they'd forgotten I was part of theirs. I needed to face them. But I needed to face them as Margaret. Not Mom, the infinite resource. Not Grandma, the free childcare. Margaret Chin, who'd loved and lost and sacrificed and finally, at 70 years old, learned that she was allowed to matter too. I turned on my phone, really on, not just to check messages, but to use it. I opened my laptop. And I sent an email to all 3 of my children with one sentence. We need to talk. All of you, video call this Sunday at 2 p.m. my time. Be there. I didn't ask. I didn't apologize. I didn't explain. I just stated what was going to happen. And then I spent the next 4 days preparing for the conversation that would either rebuild my family or end it entirely. Diane helped me practice. We role-played, her taking turns being each of my children, throwing every guilt trip, manipulation, and genuine hurt at me. She made me practice saying no without apologizing. She made me practice stating my boundaries without justifying them. She made me practice being uncomfortable while other people processed their feelings without rushing to fix them. It was the hardest acting class I'd ever taken, and I wasn't even sure I could pull it off when it mattered. Sunday came. I set up my laptop at the tiny table overlooking the ocean. I made myself tea. I wore Harold's old cardigan because I needed his steadiness, even if it was just symbolic. And at exactly 2 p.m., I logged into the video call, and there they were. My 3 children, in 3 separate boxes on my screen, looking at me like I was a stranger they used to know. Sarah looked tired. Dark circles under her eyes, hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, the kind of exhausted that comes from weeks of disrupted routine. David looked angry, jaw tight, that muscle in his cheek twitching the way it did when he was trying not to explode. Emily looked hurt, eyes red-rimmed, the youngest child who'd always been the most emotionally volatile. For a moment, no one spoke. We just looked at each other across 3,000 miles and 6 weeks of silence and 48 years of complicated history. And I realized this was it. The moment where I either became who I'd always been, or I became who I needed to be. I took a breath. And then I started talking. But here's what I need you to understand before I tell you what I said. Here's the question that every person watching this needs to ask themselves, whether you're 45 or 65 or 85. Whether you've disappeared for other people or you've demanded that someone else disappear for you. The question that makes this story matter beyond just one old woman and her complicated family. How much of yourself are you allowed to lose before the people who love you become the people who are destroying you? And when you finally choose yourself, when you finally say enough, when you finally stop being the person everyone needs and start being the person you are, does that make you selfish? Or does that make you survive? Think about that. Because what I said to my children in that video call, what happened in the weeks that followed, and what I learned about love and boundaries and the difference between sacrifice and self-destruction, that's where this story either becomes a tragedy or a triumph. And I won't lie to you. I still don't know which one it is. But I'm about to tell you anyway. What do you say to the children you raised when you're no longer the mother they think they know? That question hung in the air between us, me in my tiny Oregon apartment with the ocean behind me, them in their separate homes with their separate lives, all of us staring at each other through screens like we were strangers learning each other's faces for the first time. The silence stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only 30 seconds. 30 seconds of my children waiting for me to apologize, to explain, to become small enough that they could fit me back into the box they'd built for me. 30 seconds of me realizing that whatever I said next would either rebuild everything or burn it all down. I didn't apologize. That's the first thing you need to know about what happened in that video call. I looked at my 3 children, Sarah with her exhausted eyes and tight jaw, David with his barely controlled anger, and Emily with her wounded expression that I'd seen 1,000 times before, and I didn't say, "I'm sorry." Because I wasn't. Not for leaving. Not for choosing myself. Not for finally, at 70 years old, deciding that my life was worth living for me and not just for them. But I also didn't come in hot with accusations or anger. Diane had coached me on this. "You're not going to war," she'd said during one of our practice sessions. "You're setting the table for a different kind of meal. They're going to want to fight. Don't fight back. Just hold your ground and let them see that the ground has shifted." So I started with the truth. Simple, direct, and impossible to argue with. "I know you're angry," I said, looking at each of their faces in turn. "I know you're hurt and confused and probably feel betrayed. And I'm going to let you say all of that. But first, I need you to listen to something. Really listen. Not listening while you're preparing your response or building your defense. Just listen." David opened his mouth. He always had to go first, my anxious middle child who processed everything by talking. But Sarah put her hand up in her box on the screen. "Let her talk, David." Her voice was quiet but firm, and I saw something in her face I hadn't seen in years. Not just tiredness. Something else. Attention. Real attention. Maybe Sarah was ready to hear me in a way she hadn't been before. I took a breath, and I told them the story I'd been living for 6 weeks but also for 48 years. I told them about Harold's memorial and about David asking me to leave my own husband's remembrance to pick up kids from soccer. I told them about the moment I realized I'd become invisible, not absent, never absent, but invisible in the way infrastructure is invisible. I told them about the Tuesday childcare that became Monday through Friday, about Emily's unannounced visits that treated my home like a free therapy office, and about David's nightly calls that stretched into hours of managing his anxiety while no one ever asked how I was managing my grief. I told them about the 70 years I'd lived and the 48 years I'd spent being a mother, and the 2 years I'd spent being a widow, and how somewhere in all of that, Margaret Chin had disappeared completely. And I told them about turning off the phone at the Oregon border, and the terror and exhilaration of being unavailable, and the first time I painted something just because I wanted to, not because someone needed me to be doing something productive. And then I told them the hard part. I didn't leave because I don't love you. I left because somewhere along the way, love became labor. It became an obligation. It became this thing where I gave and gave and gave, and you took and took and took, and none of us noticed that I was disappearing in the process. And I don't blame you for that. I really don't. Because I taught you that's what mothers do. I taught you that mothers are infinite. That mothers don't need. That mothers exist to serve. And I taught you that lesson so well that when I finally couldn't do it anymore, when I finally chose myself, you experienced it as abandonment instead of survival. Emily started crying. Not the manipulative crying I'd seen so many times before. The crying that was designed to make me rush to comfort her, to make me small so she could feel supported. This was different. Quieter. More real. "Mom," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't know. I didn't know I was doing that to you." "I know," I said. And I meant it. "That's what makes this so hard. You weren't consciously trying to exploit me. You were just living your lives, needing help, and asking your mother for support. All normal things. But I never said no. I never said I can't. I never said that's too much. So you never learned where the boundaries were because I never drew them." David was shaking his head, and I could see the defensive anger building. This was the part Diane had warned me about. "So this is our fault?" he said, his voice tight. "You disappear for 6 weeks, turn off your phone, leave us terrified that you're dead somewhere, and somehow we're the bad guys because we asked our mother for help?" I didn't take the bait. I'd spent 6 weeks in Oregon learning how to sit with someone else's anger without absorbing it, without making it my responsibility to fix it. "I didn't say it was your fault, David. I said we built this dynamic together. All of us. And now I'm trying to build something different. The question is whether you can handle that." "Handle what?" Sarah asked. She still looked exhausted, but there was something in her voice that sounded almost like curiosity. "What exactly are you asking from us?" And this was it. The moment where I either caved and went back to being who they needed, or I held my ground and became who I needed to be. "I'm coming back," I said. "Not this week, not next week, but in a few weeks. I'm coming back to my hometown. But I'm not coming back to my old house. I'm getting my own place. A small condo. Something that's mine." I watched their faces. Sarah looked thoughtful. Emily looked confused. David looked like I'd slapped him. "You're not coming home?" he said. "You're coming back but not actually coming back?" "I'm coming back as Margaret," I said, "who happens to be your mother. But I'm not coming back as Mom, the woman who exists only to serve you. That woman is gone. She had to go. She was killing me." "That's dramatic," Emily said, but there was less bite in it than I expected. "Is it?" I asked. "Emily, when was the last time you asked me how I was doing? Not how are you as a greeting, but really asked. When was the last time you wondered if I was okay, if I was lonely, if I was struggling with being a widow?" She opened her mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. I don't know. "That's my point," I said gently. "I disappeared long before I got in my car and drove to Oregon. I just finally made it physical so maybe someone would notice." Sarah was nodding slowly. "I got your letter," I said, looking at her specifically. "The one you sent to my P.O. box. I read it 7 times, Sarah. And you were right about something. I did teach you that mothers sacrifice. I did teach you that mothers endure. But I taught you wrong. Or maybe I taught you right for the wrong reasons. Because mothers should love their children, should support them, and should be there for them. But not at the cost of completely disappearing. Not at the cost of their own health, their own joy, or their own existence." "So what do you want?" Sarah asked. Not confrontational. Just direct. My practical oldest daughter, always trying to solve the problem. "What does this new version look like?" And so I told them. I'd practiced this with Diane, rehearsed it until I could say it without apologizing, without softening it, without making myself small to make them comfortable. "I'll see the grandkids once a week. One day, scheduled in advance, that works for my schedule. Not emergency childcare. Not last-minute favors. Plan time where I'm grandma because I want to be, not because you need me to be." "That's it," Emily said. "1 day a week?" Mom, we have 5 kids between us. One day doesn't. One day, I said firmly. You can rotate. You can coordinate. You can figure it out. But I'm not free childcare anymore. I'm a grandmother who loves her grandchildren and wants to spend quality time with them. There's a difference. And Sunday dinners? Sarah asked. Still happens, I said. But they're potluck. Everyone brings something. Everyone cleans up. My house, my new place, is not a restaurant where I cook and serve and clean while you all sit on the couch. David laughed. Not a happy laugh. A bitter one. So basically you're saying you don't want to be our mother anymore. No, David, I said, and my voice was sharper than I intended. I'm saying I want to be your mother. Your actual mother. A human being who loves you and wants a relationship with you. Not your therapist, not your free labor, not your emotional support animal. Your mother. And if you can't tell the difference, then we have a bigger problem than I thought. The silence that followed was heavy. Uncomfortable. I forced myself to sit in it, to not rush to fill it with reassurance, or apologies, or anything that would make them feel better at my expense. This was what Diane had trained me for. The ability to let other people be uncomfortable with my boundaries without immediately backing down. Finally, Sarah spoke. I need time to process this, she said. I'm not saying no. I'm not saying yes. I'm saying I need to think about it. About what you're asking. About what I'm willing to change. That's fair, I said. I'm not okay with this, David said flatly. I'm not okay with you rewriting the rules after 48 years and acting like we're the problem. You don't get to just walk away and come back different and expect us to be fine with it. I'm not expecting you to be fine with it, I said quietly. I'm asking you to accept it anyway. Because the alternative is I stay here in Oregon and we don't have a relationship at all. And I don't want that, David. But I'll choose it if I have to. Emily was still crying, quieter now. What about the grandkids? She asked. What about Emma? She's been devastated, Mom. She thinks she did something wrong. She thinks you don't love her anymore. And here it was. The guilt trip I'd been expecting. The weapon I knew they'd use because it was the one that had always worked. Except now I understood something I hadn't before. I could love Emma. I did love Emma, without sacrificing myself for her. I could be a good grandmother without being an available every moment grandmother. I'm going to call Emma today, I said, after we hang up. I'm going to talk to her, reassure her, and let her know that none of this was her fault and that Grandma loves her very much. But Emily, you need to understand something. Emma is 8 years old. She's not responsible for managing your childcare needs. She's not supposed to be devastated because her grandmother isn't available every Tuesday and Thursday. She's supposed to have a grandmother who shows up when it matters and has her own life when it doesn't. That's actually healthier for her. Even if it's inconvenient for you. Emily flinched like I'd hit her. And maybe in a way, I had. Not with cruelty, but with truth. The kind of truth that mothers aren't supposed to speak because it makes their children uncomfortable. We talked for another 40 minutes. It wasn't easy. There were accusations and defensiveness and hurt feelings on all sides. David hung up twice, once because he was too angry to keep talking, once because I held a boundary and he couldn't handle it. Emily oscillated between understanding and guilt-tripping, sometimes in the same sentence. Sarah stayed quiet for most of it, just listening and processing, and I could see her working through something in real time. At the end of the call, we didn't have a resolution. We had something messier and more real. An agreement to keep talking. An acknowledgement that things had to change. A tentative plan for me to come back to my hometown in 3 weeks and for us to try, just try, to build something new. When I closed the laptop, I was shaking. Diane called 2 minutes later. I texted her when the call was scheduled, and I told her everything. How do you feel? She asked. Terrified, I said honestly. Like I just jumped off a cliff, and I don't know if there's water below or rocks. There's water, she said. It might be cold. It might be choppy, but there's water. You didn't destroy your relationship with your children, Margaret. You just refuse to keep destroying yourself for it. There's a difference. That night I called Emma. Her mother, my daughter Emily, put her on the phone, and I heard that small, tentative voice that broke my heart. "Grandma?" "Hi, sweetheart," I said, and I was crying before I could stop myself. "I'm so sorry I scared you. Where did you go?" she asked. Not accusatory. Just curious in the way children are curious before adults teach them to weaponize their questions. "I went to the ocean," I said. "I went to a place I'd never been before because I realized I'd been living in the same place, doing the same things, and being the same person for a very long time. And sometimes grown-ups need to go somewhere new to remember who they are." "Did you remember?" she asked. "I'm starting to," I said. "Emma, I need you to know something very important. None of this, none of me going away, was because of you. You didn't do anything wrong. You are perfect exactly as you are, and Grandma loves you so much. Are you coming back?" Her voice was so small, so hopeful. "I am," I said. "In a few weeks, I'm coming back. And I'm going to have a new apartment, and you're going to come visit me, and we're going to have special grandmama days where we do things together. Just you and me. Can we paint?" she asked. "Mom says you've been painting now." "We can absolutely paint," I said, smiling through my tears. "I'm not very good yet, but we can learn together. Would you like that?" "Yes," she said. And then, after a pause, "Grandma? I'm glad you found the ocean. Mom says you've never seen it before. That seems sad." Out of the mouths of babes. "It was sad, honey. But I've seen it now. And it's beautiful. And someday, when you're a little older, maybe I'll take you there too." We talked for 20 more minutes about school and her friends and the new babysitter, who was nice but not me. And when we hung up, I felt something shift. Not relief exactly. Not resolution. But possibility. The possibility that I could be a grandmother who mattered to Emma without disappearing for her. That I could love her while also loving myself. That these two things weren't mutually exclusive. The next 3 weeks were strange. I stayed in Oregon, but my little apartment started to feel less like a hideout and more like a way station. I kept painting. I was getting slightly less terrible, which Diane found hilarious. I kept walking the beach every morning, storing up the sound of the waves for when I'd be back in a landlocked state. I kept going to the coffee shop and the library and the small life I'd built, knowing I'd have to leave it soon but grateful I'd had it at all. Diane helped me find a condo back in my hometown. A small place, 1 bedroom, on the 3rd floor of a building with an elevator and a little balcony. Not ocean views, but a view of trees and sky, which was more than I'd had in my old house, where the windows mostly looked at other houses. It was available immediately, and I signed the lease over video call, which felt surreal and perfect at the same time. Sarah called twice in those 3 weeks. Emily called once. David didn't call at all. But I'd expected that. David was going to need the most time because David had used me the most completely. Not maliciously. He was the anxious one, the one who'd always needed the most emotional management, the one who never quite learned to self-soothe without his mother's voice telling him it would be okay. Me setting boundaries with David felt to him like abandonment because he never learned the difference between support and complete emotional enmeshment. Sarah's calls were different. More thoughtful. In the second one, she said something that surprised me. "I've been thinking about what you said about how you taught us that mothers are infinite, and I realize I'm doing the same thing with my kids, especially my daughters. I'm teaching them that women sacrifice, that women serve, that women don't have needs that matter, and I don't want that for them, Mom. I don't want them to be 50 years old and suddenly realize they've disappeared. Then teach them something different," I said. "Teach them that women can be loving and generous and supportive and also have boundaries. That these things aren't opposites. That saying no sometimes is what makes the yes meaningful." "I don't know how," she admitted. "Neither do I," I said. "I'm 70 years old, and I'm just learning." But maybe we can learn together. Maybe that's what this becomes. When moving day came, Diane drove me back. 12 hours in the car, her old Toyota packed with my one suitcase, my watercolors, Harold's photo, and 6 weeks of transformation that couldn't be packed in boxes. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. She'd been where I was going, back to the place you left, but as someone new. She knew what I was feeling. Terror and hope in equal measure. She helped me move into the condo. My children didn't. I told them I needed to do this part alone, needed to set up my space without their input or opinions or the subtle ways they tried to make it about them. The condo was small, but it was mine. I hung my terrible watercolors on the walls. I put Harold's photo on the nightstand. I bought a small table for the balcony where I could have coffee in the mornings and watch the trees. It didn't look like much, but it looked like Margaret. And that was everything. My first Sunday dinner in the new place was 3 weeks after I moved back. I'd given everyone the ground rules: potluck, everyone cleans up, we're here from 1 to 4, and then I have my evening to myself. Sarah came with her family, bringing us salad and garlic bread. Emily came alone. She and her husband were taking a break, whatever that meant, and her kids were with him. David didn't come. Sarah said he was still processing, which I knew was code for still angry and punishing you with his absence. It hurt. Of course it hurt. But I'd talked to Diane about this possibility, and she'd said something wise. Some people won't be able to make the journey with you. Not because they don't love you, but because your transformation requires them to transform too, and they're not ready. Maybe they'll never be ready. And you have to decide if you can live with that. I could. It wasn't easy, but I could. Dinner was awkward at first. No one quite knew what to do in this new dynamic where I wasn't serving everything and cleaning everything and managing everyone's emotions. But slowly, tentatively, we found a rhythm. Sarah's husband, my son-in-law Tom, who I'd always liked but rarely had real conversations with, actually talked to me like a person. Asked about Oregon, about what I'd discovered there, about the painting. Emily helped clear the table without being asked, and when she started to spiral about her marriage, I listened for 10 minutes and then gently said, "Emily, I love you, and I want to support you, but I can't be your therapist. Have you thought about seeing someone professional?" She looked shocked. Then hurt. Then, slowly, thoughtfully. "I haven't," she admitted. "I guess I always just talk to you. And you can still talk to me," I said. "But I can't be the only person you talk to. That's too much weight for a mother-daughter relationship to carry." She didn't like it. But she nodded. And the next week, Sarah told me Emily had made an appointment with a therapist. Small victories. Emma spent most of the dinner on my lap, and when it was time to go, she asked if she could come back next week, just her, for our painting day. "Of course," I said. "Does Tuesday work for you?" And I watched Sarah's face. That flash of realization that Tuesday, my old childcare day, was now my granddaughter day on my terms. She swallowed whatever she was going to say and just nodded. "Tuesday works." After they left, I stood on my little balcony, and I thought about Harold. About what he'd want from me. And I knew he'd be proud. Not because I'd done something dramatic or heroic, but because I'd finally kept the promise I made in that hospital room. I'd done something for myself. I'd stopped disappearing. The weeks that followed weren't easy. David eventually called, stiff and formal, and we had a careful conversation where neither of us said what we really meant. But it was a start. Emily kept coming to Sunday dinners and kept trying to navigate this new version of having a mother who had boundaries. Sarah and I fell into something that looked almost like friendship. She'd stop by my condo sometimes, just to talk, not because she needed something but because she wanted to see me. And Emma. Sweet Emma came every Tuesday for our painting days. We'd set up at my little table on the balcony, two terrible painters learning together, and she'd tell me about her week and I'd tell her about mine, and she started to see me not just as the grandmother who served but as Margaret, a person who had a life and interests and dreams. One Tuesday, she asked me what I'd wanted to be when I was young, before I became a mother. And I realized it was the first time anyone in my family had asked me that question in decades. I wanted to be a photographer, I told her. I wanted to travel and take pictures of places no one had seen before. Why didn't you? She asked, brush poised over her paper. Because I became a mother, I said. And back then, we thought you had to choose. You couldn't be both. She thought about this. Could you do it now? She asked. Could you learn photography like you learned painting? And something in me sparked. Yes, I said slowly. Yes, I could. I bought a camera the next week. Nothing fancy, just a good beginner camera and some online tutorials. I was 70 years old, learning something new, and it felt like defiance and joy all at once. I started taking pictures of my small life, the trees from my balcony, the light on the coffee cup in the morning, and Emma's concentrated face while she painted. Nothing grand. Nothing magazine-worthy. But mine. 3 months after I came back, David finally came to Sunday dinner. He was still guarded, still hurt, but he came. And at the end of the evening, when everyone was leaving, he hung back. Mom, he said, and his voice cracked. I've been seeing a therapist. For the anxiety. Like you suggested. I hadn't suggested it directly, but I'd implied it in that video call months ago. How's it going? I asked. Hard, he admitted. She says I've been using you as an emotional crutch. That I never learned to manage my own feelings because you were always there to manage them for me. He looked at me, really looked at me. I didn't know I was doing that. I didn't know I was hurting you. I know, I said. And I hugged him, my complicated middle child, and I felt something loosen in my chest. Not forgiveness. There was nothing to forgive, but reconnection. The possibility that we could have a relationship that didn't require my disappearance. 6 months after I moved back, I had a small art show at the community center. Not because my paintings were good, they weren't, not really, but because the teacher encouraged all of us to display our work. I invited my children, not expecting them to come. Sarah came. Emily came. David didn't, but he sent flowers with a card that said, "Proud of you, Mom." And that was enough. Emma stood in front of my paintings, my terrible, wonderful, honest paintings, and she said, "Grandma, you're really brave." And I realized she was right. Not because I'd left or because I'd come back, but because I'd refused to stay disappeared. Because I'd chosen myself even when it was terrifying. Because I'd shown her something I wish someone had shown me at her age. That women are allowed to matter. That grandmothers are people. That sacrifice isn't the same as love. Now, here's where I need to tell you something important. Something about how this story ends, or doesn't end, because life isn't neat like that. My relationship with my children is still complicated. David and I still navigate carefully around his disappointment that I'm not the mother he remembers. Emily still sometimes forgets my boundaries and has to be reminded. Sarah is probably the one who's changed the most, who's really tried to see me differently, but even she has moments where she slips back into old patterns. And me? I still feel guilty sometimes. Still have moments where I wonder if I was selfish, if I damaged something irreparable, if my grandchildren will remember me as the grandmother who left. But then I have a Tuesday with Emma, or I take a photo that captures something true, or I stand on my balcony with my morning coffee, and I remember what Diane told me all those months ago in Oregon. You can't love people well if you disappear in the process. I'm 70 years old. I've been a daughter, a wife, a mother, a grandmother, and a widow. And now, finally, I'm also Margaret. All of these things at once. Not one or the other. Not sacrificing one identity for another. Just me, in all my complicated, imperfect wholeness. Do I regret leaving? No. Do I regret the pain it caused? Yes. Both things are true. That's what I've learned in this year of transformation. Two opposing truths can exist simultaneously. I can love my children and need distance from them. I can be a good mother and still choose myself. I can honor the 48 years I spent in service to my family and also honor the woman who finally said enough. Here's what I want you to understand, especially if you're watching this and you're 45 or 55 or 65 or 75 and you've been disappearing for other people, slowly, piece by piece, need by need. It's not too late. It's never too late to choose yourself. It's never too late to draw boundaries, to say no, to reclaim the parts of yourself you gave away thinking that's what love required. It's scary, God, it's terrifying, but it's possible. And you deserve it. You deserve to be seen, to be valued, to be a person and not just a function. And if you're watching this and you're the adult child of someone who's been disappearing, please listen to this. Your parents' boundaries are not a rejection of you. Their need for a life outside of serving you is not abandonment. It's survival. And if you love them, really love them, not just need them, you'll learn to see them as a whole person, not just as the role they play in your life. You'll learn that the most loving thing you can do is let them be human. I still live in my little condo. I still have Tuesday painting days with Emma, and now sometimes her cousins come too, and we're slowly building a relationship that's based on love, not obligation. I still take Sunday dinners with whoever shows up, and I don't apologize anymore when I end them at 4 o'clock because I have my own life to live. I still take photographs of my small, ordinary, beautiful life. And sometimes, when I'm feeling brave, I think about taking that trip to Paris that I dreamed about at 23. Maybe next year. Maybe the year after. But maybe. Harold's been gone for 3 years now. I still miss him. I still talk to him sometimes, telling him about the ocean I finally saw and the life I finally claimed. I think he'd be proud. I think he'd say he told me so. I think he'd take my terrible paintings and hang them on every wall and tell anyone who'd listen that his Maggie was an artist now. I'm not the same woman I was when I ghosted my children on that Tuesday morning. But I'm also not the same woman I was before I left. I'm somewhere in between, broken and healed, guilty and free, loving and boundaried. I'm a work in progress at 70 years old, and honestly, that feels exactly right. So here's my question for you. Not the one I asked at the end of Act 2 about how much of yourself you're allowed to lose. That was about survival. This one is different. This one is about thriving. Are you ready to stop disappearing? Are you ready to claim yourself, even if it's terrifying, even if people you love don't understand, even if it means rebuilding relationships from the ground up? Are you ready to show the young people in your life, your children, your grandchildren, the people watching you, that it's never too late to matter? Because here's what I learned. You teach people how to love you. And if you've been teaching them that love means your complete disappearance, you can unteach that. It won't be easy. It won't be comfortable. Some people won't make the journey with you. But the alternative is spending the rest of your life as a ghost in your own story. And you, yes you, watching this right now, you deserve to be the protagonist. I want to hear from you. I want to know your story. Have you disappeared for others? Are you struggling to set boundaries with adult children or aging parents or partners who've learned to expect your sacrifice? Are you the adult child of someone who's been disappearing, and you're just now realizing it? Or are you somewhere in between, trying to navigate the impossible territory of loving people without losing yourself? Leave a comment below. Tell me your story. Tell me what resonated. Tell me what made you angry or uncomfortable or seen. Tell me if you're ready to stop disappearing or if you're terrified to start. Tell me if you think I'm brave or selfish or both. I want to hear it all because these conversations, these honest, messy, complicated conversations about family and sacrifice and the cost of love, they matter. They might be the most important conversations we're not having. And if this story touched something in you, if it made you think or feel or question, share it. Share it with your children, your parents, and your friends who are struggling with these same questions. Share it with the people in your life who need to hear that boundaries aren't betrayal, that choosing yourself isn't abandonment, and that love can survive transformation. Subscribe to Senior Wisdom Tales for more stories like this, stories about the messy, complicated, beautiful work of being human at any age. Stories about the courage it takes to change when everyone expects you to stay the same. Stories about the radical act of mattering. I'm Margaret Chin. I'm 70 years old. I ghosted my children and found myself. And I'm still here, still learning, still becoming. And if I can do it at 70, you can do it at whatever age you're watching this. It's not too late. It's never too late. Now go. Think. Feel. Comment. Share. And maybe, just maybe, start asking yourself the question that changed my life. What would happen if I finally chose myself? What would happen if I stopped disappearing? There's only one way to find out. Thank you for listening to my story. Now I want to hear yours.